Okay, so, we always ask you to send in stuff that's got you thinking, and wow, did you guys deliver with
Yeah, this one's a real doozy.
Yeah, you sent in this YouTube transcript from the channel Psyche, and the title alone is enough to make you stop and think, can you handle Nietzsche's most dangerous thought?
So we're not messing around with any life hacks today.
Oh, no, this is deep. This is getting into some seriously heavy stuff.
Yeah, we're going deep on this one, really questioning like the foundations of what we believe, why we believe it, and what that means for how we live our lives.
Exactly, like no pressure or anything.
Right, like this is the kind of stuff that can like totally shift your perspective, like how you see the world, maybe even yourself.
Big time. And our goal, I think, with this one is to take these ideas that can be so powerful and honestly kind of unsettling and make them like clear,
Make them real for people.
Yeah, exactly. Relevant to your actual life without getting lost in, all the philosophical jargon.
Yeah, we want you to walk away with a few aha moments for sure.
Totally.
Yeah.
So that's our mission for you today, folks. Unpack this whole dangerous thought thing and really get to the core of what Nietzsche's trying to tell us.
Yeah. And hopefully you come out the other side not feeling totally overwhelmed, but maybe with like a new way of looking at things.
Exactly. All right, let's jump right in. So Nietzsche, this guy, he starts off talking about this illusion of morality thing. What's the deal with that?
What's really interesting here is that he's arguing that a lot of what we consider like universal moral truths, our ideas about good and evil, right and wrong.
The shoulds and shouldn'ts.
Right, exactly. He's saying these might not actually be like divine decrees or some, inherent part of the universe.
Like set in stone.
Right. Instead, he suggests that a big chunk of what we call morality, particularly what he calls slave morality, actually comes from people who felt powerless,
The folks who felt kind of resentful.
Yeah, exactly. And they use it as a way to gain some influence over those with more power.
Okay, so slave morality, that's a pretty loaded term. What's that look like in everyday life?
Think about the values that get praised in society. Obedience, being submissive, putting others' needs first.
Humility, self-sacrifice.
Exactly, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Nietzsche's arguing that those weren't the values that were like championed by the naturally powerful, the dominant individuals in a society.
Interesting.
Instead, he says that these values were actually emphasized by the people who lacked power as a way to like morally bind and control those who did have.
So like a way to level the playing.
Yeah, in a sense, by making these traits seem super important. The weak could kind of cast judgment on the strong for being ambitious or self-assertive.
So if you're someone who's really driven, you set your own goal. You go after what you want. Nietzsche's saying that this slave morality might label you as selfish or arrogant, even if you're not actually hurting.
Exactly. And he points out that in this kind of moral framework, anyone who doesn't prioritize the needs of the collective above their own potential is often seen in a negative light.
They're the bad guy.
Pretty much, it's like a way for the majority, who might not be as driven or capable, to feel morally superior and to keep those who might challenge the status quo in check.
Fascinating. So next time you see someone getting slammed for being too ambitious, maybe take a minute to think about what values are really at play there.
Right, exactly.
It's like he's saying this kind of morality pushes everyone towards being kind of average, discouraging anyone from excelling or rocking the boat too much.
Yeah, that's a key insight. He's arguing that this leveling down effect can actually prevent people with exceptional abilities from reaching their full potential.
It's like they have to dim their light to fit in.
Yeah, they might feel pressured to hide their strengths or their ambitions just to blend in with a society that prioritizes conformity and self-denial.
And anyone who stands out, who dares to do their own thing, automatically becomes a threat.
A threat to the established order, exactly.
So why do you think most people go along with this? I mean, why do we prefer this idea of a just world where good is always rewarded and bad is always punished?
Well, Nietzsche suggests it all comes down to a fear of freedom.
Fear of freedom.
Yeah, think about it. The idea that there might not be this like inherent moral structure to the universe.
No cosmic justice.
Right, that good deeds don't automatically lead to happiness and bad deeds don't automatically lead to suffering. That can be really unsettling for people.
Because it means you're responsible for your own actions.
Exactly. You're accountable for your choices and their consequences with no guarantees.
So we cling to these moral codes, even if they're just human constructs, because it's scarier to face that ultimate freedom.
Yeah, it's like we're choosing to limit ourselves. It's a form of self-imposed confinement.
We buy into the system and then judge others who don't.
It's almost like saying, well, if I have to play by these rules, then everyone else should too.
Right. I get it. Okay, so that's a pretty heavy take on morality. Now let's talk about another one of Nietzsche's famous lines, God is dead. What did he really mean by that, and how does it connect to all this?
Okay, so yeah, God is dead. It's probably his most famous and also most misunderstood idea.
I can imagine.
He wasn't actually saying that God doesn't exist. It's not about atheism.
More like a metaphor.
Exactly. It's more of an observation about a huge shift that was happening in Western thought.
Yeah.
The gradual erosion of all these traditional certainties, like the idea of a divine moral order.
The things that people had relied on for centuries.
Right. And this shift was being driven by science, reason, critical thinking.
So it's not that God literally died, but more like the idea of a fixed, divinely established set of rules was starting to lose its grip.
Exactly. And the consequence of this death, as Nietzsche saw it, is that we lose that ultimate authority figure that tells us what's good and what's evil.
And we're left staring into this abyss of responsibility.
Pretty much. And the question becomes, well, if God's not setting the moral compass, then who is?
And Nietzsche's answer is?
You are. Each individual is.
Whoa. Okay, that's both incredibly empowering and kind of terrifying, don't you?
Definitely both. And I don't think humanity's handled this loss of certainty very well in general.
Yeah, it makes sense that we'd scramble to find something to replace it.
Right. Nietzsche noticed that humans have this strong urge to create new gods to fill the void.
And he doesn't necessarily mean religious figures, right?
Right. It could be anything. Ideologies, political movements, charismatic leaders,
Belief systems.
Exactly. Anything that offers a sense of absolute truth or ready-made answers.
Even people who consider themselves atheists can fall into this trap.
Totally. They might cling to social norms or unquestioned truth just to feel that sense of comfort and belonging.
We crave something to believe in, to give us a sense of structure and meaning.
But Nietzsche's perspective is that the death of God should actually be liberating, not something to despair over.
Because it means we have the freedom to create our own meaning.
Exactly. If the universe doesn't come with a prepackaged set of instructions, then you have the complete freedom and the complete responsibility to create your own values.
But doesn't he also talk about something called passive nihilism?
He does, and that's kind of the flip side of this whole freedom thing.
So what's passive nihilism?
It's basically what happens when people realize there's no inherent meaning in the universe and they just give up.
They're like, well, nothing matters, so why bother?
Exactly. They become apathetic, resigned. They just seek distractions.
Yeah.
Entertainment, fleeting pleasures, just to avoid confronting that existential emptiness.
It's like giving up on life, almost.
It can be. And then there's this other fear that comes up. If there are no absolute moral rules, doesn't that mean anything is permitted?
That's a pretty natural concern, I think.
Absolutely, and Nietzsche addresses it head on. He says that truly strong individuals, the ones who've mastered themselves, they don't need to exploit or harm others.
Their strength comes from within.
Exactly. It's about self-control and self-awareness. The desire to dominate others, he says, often comes from weakness.
A need to compensate for something lacking inside.
True freedom for Nietzsche isn't about having no constraints at all. It's about consciously creating your own code of conduct.
Based on really understanding yourself and the world, not just blindly following rules. So it's more about internal discipline than external control. That's a really important distinction.
It is.
Okay, so this brings us to the Übermensch, often translated as Superman. What was Nietzsche getting at with this idea?
The Übermensch is probably his most aspirational concept, and it's really important to understand that it's not meant to be taken literally like some comic book hero.
No capes.
Right? It's more of an ideal, an individual who has moved beyond the limitations of imposed morality and created their own values after the death of God.
So it's about becoming someone who's self-made in a very deep sense.
Yeah, they don't need external approval or justification for their actions. They operate based on their own internal compass.
They create their own meaning and purpose.
Exactly.
That sounds amazing, but also potentially very lonely. Does Nietzsche talk about the social implications of being this kind of radical individual?
He does, and he acknowledges that there's a cost to this level of freedom.
Like,
anyone who truly follows this path will inevitably face criticism, maybe even hostility, from people who feel threatened by someone who doesn't conform, who doesn't need permission to exist.
Because most people want to belong, to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Right. They cling to established ideologies or dogmas for a sense of security. But the Übermensch, they don't need those external affiliations.
They build their own framework, and that can be isolating.
Loneliness can definitely be a part of it.
It seems like becoming this Übermensch would require a huge break from societal norms, even from your own deeply ingrained beliefs.
Absolutely. Nietzsche emphasizes breaking free from all that childhood conditioning, from the fear of standing out.
It's about questioning everything you've been taught and actively shaping your own values.
Yeah, he had zero patience for a life lived as a slave to rules imposed by others.
And he knew that this path would likely lead to a certain separation from the herd.
Right.
So he's making a pretty clear distinction between different ways of living then.
In a way, he talks about creators, those who forge their own path and define their own values, and followers, those who stick to the pre-established norms and look to others for guidance.
And he's basically asking us, which one do you want to be?
Yeah, that's the question.
It sounds like a pretty tough, maybe even painful process to actually become this Übermensch?
It is, Nietzsche describes it as a process of dismantling all your certainties, beliefs, illusions, everything you might have taken for granted, and then rebuilding from scratch.
Talk about a renovation project.
And of course, this will lead to misunderstanding and criticism from others because your very way of being challenges their own beliefs and comfortable routines.
It's like your freedom reminds them of their own lack of freedom.
And that can be really uncomfortable for people.
This all seems to tie back into that idea of voluntary slavery that Nietzsche talked about. What does he mean by that?
This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Nietzsche observed this fascinating paradox that even though many people claim to want freedom and autonomy,
They say they want to be in control.
right, but in reality, they actually prefer following orders and having someone else tell them what's right and wrong.
They want the comfort of someone else being in charge.
Exactly. And he calls this voluntary slavery because at its core, it's a choice.
Even if it's an unconscious one.
Right.
But why would someone choose to be a slave in this sense?
Because true freedom, the kind Nietzsche is talking about, demands absolute responsibility.
So no more blaming other people or circumstances.
Nope. If you're truly free to define your own values and action, then you can't hide behind rules or play the victim.
You're fully accountable.
And that weight of responsibility can be really heavy for a lot of people. So they choose to limit themselves. They stay within the confines of accepted laws and traditions and unquestioned values.
They find safety in the structure, even if it means giving up some of their freedom.
Exactly. And this links back to that idea of slave morality, where those who feel weak or powerless create a system that justifies their own submission and keeps the strong in check.
By making ambition and self-assertion look bad.
Right. So the whole system is rigged to maintain the status quo.
And anyone who steps outside of that gets punished.
Not just by institutions, but also by social pressure. Ostracism, gossip, criticism from their peers.
Because those people feel threatened.
Exactly. The very existence of someone living by their own values can be a painful reminder to others of the choices they haven't made.
The paths they haven't taken.
Right.
So how do we break free from this cycle of voluntary servitude?
Nietzsche believed it all starts with courage.
Yeah.
The courage to question everything you've been taught, to take ownership of your life and choices.
To stop waiting for permission to be yourself.
Exactly. And that means challenging the things you've learned, accepting the uncertainty and potential loneliness that comes with forging your own path.
It's not going to be easy.
Definitely not.
Okay, so this all sounds pretty radical, and it raises a big question. If we start rejecting all these societal rules, won't that just link to chaos?
That's the worry, right? Is Nietzsche just saying anything goes?
Yeah.
But it's important to understand the nuance here.
Okay, so what's the nuance?
He wasn't advocating for lawlessness or reckless. Remember, true freedom for him is about self-mastery.
And creating your own values based on self-awareness.
Exactly. The real danger he saw was in nihilism, that emptiness and loss of meaning that can happen when you reject traditional values without having anything to replace them.
So just throwing out the rule book doesn't automatically lead to a good outcome.
Nope, you need something to guide you internally.
Otherwise, it's just chaos.
Right. And Nietzsche contrasts this nihilism with the disciplined freedom of the Übermensch, who creates their own rules out of self-understanding, not just out of whim.
So it's not about doing whatever you feel like in the moment.
No, it takes self-controlled discipline, a clear sense of purpose.
Otherwise, you're just going to self-destruct.
Pretty much. And he believed that the inability to create your own meaning is what drives people to seek external control.
Yeah.
Leaders, systems, rules.
Because they need someone else to give their life structure.
Exactly. So the real danger of rejecting the rules isn't external chaos, it's internal chaos.
And the Übermensch is the one who can face that abyss of freedom and create their own meaning. Okay, so this has been incredibly thought-provoking, but it's also pretty abstract. How do we actually apply these ideas in our everyday lives?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Understanding the concepts is just the first step. Nietzsche emphasized that no one is going to give you permission to be free. You have to take it for yourself.
So where do we start?
Start by questioning all those automatic rules and assumptions you live by. Look at your beliefs and ask yourself, why do I believe this? Who taught me this?
Do they actually align with my values, or am I just following them out of habit or because everyone else is?
Exactly. And this questioning comes with a big responsibility.
Because you're taking ownership.
Right. Total freedom means total responsibility. No more excuses, no more blaming others. You own the consequences of your decisions.
And that can be lonely.
It can definitely lead to criticism from people who don't get it or who feel threatened by your choices.
And Nietzsche also talks about the importance of thinking for yourself, right?
Huge. He called it herd mentality, when people just blindly follow the crowd. And he urged people to educate themselves, to seek out different perspectives, to form their own conclusions without fearing judgment.
So don't be a sheep, basically.
Right. Be your own person. But he also warned against confusing freedom with impulsive.
So it's not about just doing whatever you want, whenever you want.
No true freedom requires self-controlled discipline, a sense of purpose.
Otherwise, it all falls apart.
Yeah, he used the analogy of life as a work of art, something you consciously shape and mold. And that creative process involves taking risks and accepting criticism.
So the big question is, are you ready to become the artist of your own life?
That's what it comes down to. Are you a creator or a follower?
Wow, that was a lot to unpack. Nietzsche really throws down the gauntlet, doesn't he?
He does. He forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world.
We've talked about his critique of morality, the death of God, the Übermensch, this idea of voluntary slavery, and the balance between freedom and chaos. It's all connected. And ultimately, it's about taking responsibility for your own life and choices.
And realizing that you have the power to create your own meaning.
Exactly.
So the choice is yours. Are you going to follow the herd or forge your own path?
What will you create?
That's something for you to ponder as you go about your day.
We hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought and maybe even sparked some of those aha moments.
Keep those questions coming, folks. And until next time, happy diving.